Great, thanks. Always good to be back in Danville. I definitely know some faces in the crowd, and I'm sure we'll get to know each other even more so over the coming months. Again, it's great to be back, and this is a type of project that we really embrace, and it's a type of project that really is kind of fun. We do a lot of different kinds of work around the state, and we've done a lot of work in Danville over the years, whether it be with the school system or different businesses, industry, Center College. So even though I haven't lived here for a while, we keep in touch. Danville, while I'm not a resident, I definitely claim Danville. I'm a native of Danville. I've often said I'd love to live in Danville if it's just a little bit closer to Lexington, but if that were the case, it would be Nicholasville, and don't want to do that.
Well,
hopefully there's no. Well, no. Hopefully there's no Nicholasville residents that I just insulted. Danville really is a special place, and it's hard to find anybody that doesn't hold that opinion. So tonight, I really want to just get into introducing the project, and in some ways, I'll refer to this as Wayfinding 101. And it's not that you all don't know about wayfinding, it's more about trying to tell you how we approach doing wayfinding in a community. And it's a lot more than just hanging signs up wherever on a building or a signpost. And it's really about helping to continue making and enhancing the community as a real place. And we'll talk about that as we go through the presentation tonight. And let me back up just a bit. Hopefully everybody will sign in. There are some agenda sheets if you didn't get those. There's also some of my business cards back there if you'd like to continue communicating with me via email or cell phone. I think I mixed up my Lexington and Louisville business cards, but the commonality is cell phone and email, and who uses anything else other than that anyway. So please feel free to communicate with me anytime after the meeting. So tonight we're just going to go through some basic wayfinding kinds of information. There is an interactive part of this that we'll get into a couple of items that we would like for you to participate in. We'll get into that towards the end of the meeting. I want to talk about the goals and objectives, and please, if you feel like, for instance, we've missed something relative to what we're looking at or what we want to do, we would like to hear that. Don't feel like this is just me talking tonight. I would like to also listen. So our first endeavor is really listening and looking, and we're on fact-finding mission. While I know a lot about Danville, and in many ways, Danville hasn't changed a whole lot in terms of its physical environment. The puzzle is still very much the same, but the puzzle pieces maybe have changed around a bit. But there's been a lot of, Danville's a very progressive community. There's new people, new places, new businesses. Some of the institutions are the same. But knowing about the community is very important. And wayfinding is not necessarily an old topic, but it has changed a lot. From 30 years ago, wayfinding meant something different than it does today, because we all have our cell phones and GPS, and they'll talk to you and tell you if you made the wrong turn. But yet, visual, tactile kinds of components of a wayfinding system are important. So please interact with us tonight. Matt and I will be taking notes and listening, and what you have to say is very important. So I talked a little bit about the history of wayfinding. People have always looked for signs and clues of how to move around, whether it would be a fence post or a stone or a cloud or a star. But that really takes us back into history. But wayfinding, as I mentioned before, really has come a long way. Just 30 to 40 years ago, wayfinding really started taking on a meaning of how can wayfinding really identify a place and not necessarily just giving directions. And I think that's important as we begin thinking about how can we enhance Danville's sense of place. So that began, those ideas began progressing to a point where wayfinding really was more about just identification and direction, where it began to encompass more on a holistic basis about what a place is. And we'll get into talking about how we really, wayfinding will take on this holistic sense, and how we begin using the history and the culture of the community. How branding, and I know we'll talk a little bit about the branding exercise that the community's gone through, how that can be integrated into this wayfinding. So uniformity and systematic are two words I use a lot with when I talk about wayfinding. And we've used these principles with some tweaking in other communities often. We've recently completed a wayfinding plan for the city of Frankfort, which we'll be showing some examples of that, just as examples of what wayfinding components are. We're finishing up a wayfinding plan for the city of Corbin. Now, Frankfort, Mr. K. Wood, Frankfort and Corbin are not like Danville, although from a physical environment standpoint and population size and how people travel through the community, there are many similarities. So we, just as an anecdotal side note, we prepared the Wayfinding Master Plan for the city of Frankfort and actually did construction documents. That document was used to submit for a state grant, and within the past year the city of Frankfort was awarded about a $600,000 grant based on the work that the city had hired us to do. So keep those kinds of things in your crosshairs, because wayfinding components, a systematic plan, can cost dollars and cents. So wayfinding, where am I and where am I going? I think that's kind of a given part of what a wayfinding system is about. And so what we do is endeavor to get people oriented into a community or a particular place. And we oftentimes will use these same principles, say on a college campus or an environment of a lot of different buildings. So, but say if you go onto the campus of EKU or University of Kentucky, it can be really confusing. So you have to orient yourself, just like you want to orient people in a community such as Danville. One of the primary components of wayfinding, while it's not the only component, is being able to make decisions and giving people choices to determine what route they're going to take, and while on that route, when to make a decision. And we'll talk a little bit later on, and we'll get you all involved in this, what are the decision points in the various different routes. We've already begun identifying some decision points, and we'll show you in a few minutes, but this is a really critical item. And then we really get down in the weeds at those decision points to determine what are the decisions that we're wanting people to make at those particular points. But that's a really key item. So as you move, and somewhat part of that, as you move along this route, part of decision making is still allowing people to kind of monitor where they are. So for instance, if I was going along Lexington Avenue and at 3rd Street, I'll just use as an example, I had all arrows pointing to the left, to whether it be the hospital or the downtown or the courthouse. I mean, people may be confused because maybe they're going to Center College and there's a better route, say, to go on down and maybe turn, either go all the way to Maple or something like that. But so we need to continue monitoring that route and give people choices. We don't want to give them just one decision to make to go in a certain direction. And then, really important, this goes to the point I was talking about as far as kind of this placemaking or identifying places, is when you get somewhere and make a particular decision or destination, making sure people know that you're there and that is clearly marked, and that when you're there at a particular destination, do they turn left, right, go straight, where's parking? So decisions are extremely important. So as planners, we sit behind the steering wheel, if you will, to try and predict what decisions are and what the monitoring needs to be along the route, along many routes. We're actually, you'll see here in a few minutes, we look at many different routes. So, and again, I'm going to go through this. If you have questions about it or comments, please let me know. And again, this is kind of Wayfinding 101 orientation class, so to speak. So wayfinding can communicate in a lot of different ways, and there's a lot of different forms of that. And there's different hierarchies and protocols, and I'll show you some examples of that. But while you think about wayfinding is really critical primarily for visitors, it can be important to residents also. Sometimes the residents of a community don't really know the best routes or exactly where to park at a certain location. And wayfinding can get down in the weeds of identifying parking lots or specific elements. It's not necessarily just about, that's like, a parking lot is like a sub-destination. So if you're going to the hospital, perhaps that's fine, you see the hospital here in front of you on 3rd Street, but where do I park? So that becomes a sub-destination as part of this route monitoring. This is important, and I know we already have some gateway signs at various different points in the community, but it begins to, that initial wayfinding component, that first message, that gateway sign really gives that first impression. And it also lets you know that you are somewhere. One example of that, and we have photos of this, is out on Route 34, 34, coming in from 27. That sign, that main sign is now pulled back, and I should know this, but I think maybe that sign was there before the bypass was put in. So that's what I thought. So actually, you see that sign, it's not a bad sign. But then you come up to that left-hand turn and there's just a very small sign. So it becomes a little bit confusing. So, we think about that. We're looking at all these existing conditions and assessing, what really is the best way to let people know that you are somewhere, and then let them know how to go to wherever within a community. So we'll be looking at a lot of different scales of wayfinding components and signs. And this has a lot to do with a lot about how you're moving. So if you're out on the bypass and you're traveling at 55 or 60 miles an hour, that scale of sign is going to be much different than if you're walking downtown on Main Street and you're just walking a couple miles an hour. So plus the eye levels and a lot of factors. So, but we're going to be looking at a family of signs, and we'll show you some examples here in a few minutes. And the way that you're moving, the means that you're moving, and how quickly you're moving is important. So we talked about the branding, and you see the Danville, Kentucky historically bowed, and it's understanding this is the branding image that has, I think, has been accepted. I'm not sure if adopted is the correct word, but I think this is now the image that the community has been working on for quite some time. So it's important that we use, and usually that's somebody in the audience, and it's me this time. I apologize. But it's important that we use the uniformity that is brought forward with the wayfinding or with the branding of a community. So, what do we have here in town? Okay, so I've kind of gone through some orientation. Now we get into what we've been doing in the past 3 or 4 weeks, and we've spent time on the ground. We've been exploring the community. Matt's traveled around just about every primary street, looked at what you have, and you all probably know what you have. And this is just a sampling of a lot of what you have. But I think what's informative about this is you have a lot. And you have a lot of different things. So we're being tasked with bringing some uniformity to wayfinding. And so we look at this, we look at what you have, and is there something better that you could do? Do we let some of this inform us and maybe utilize some of the what we call design vocabulary or their expressions, some of these, or do we start over? But it's important that we understand that you have a lot and that we need to improve what you have. And that may be cleaning the slate and starting out with a blank palette also. And again, just some additional examples of the signage you have around town. And what we will be doing, and we haven't started this yet, as far as actually coming up with real ideas, we've actually started. But we will be coming up with what we refer to as a kit of parts. And we'll be looking at some immediate issues about how we can improve the streets and roads and corridors through the community with wayfinding. But that doesn't mean that you will not have the parts for future considerations. As new destinations or new places or new businesses or whatever it might be come online that you may need in the future. So we're looking out there, we're trying to look in the crystal ball and predict about the future a bit and give the community a kit of parts of what you can do. And again, the kit of parts will be uniform, that can be placed in a systematic way. So we came into this project back 2 or 3 months ago with, and fortunately and extremely pleased that we were selected. And we established a set of goals for the project that we presented to the community and wanted to go over those with you. So first of all, establish criteria for the destinations based on what you all talk to us about, and we're going to talk in a little bit about destinations and get your all's input. We're going to develop a family of signs. I'll show you some examples of that, but signs for kind of all different applications, different scales, and that'll be some of the outcome of our work. Strategic locations is very important. And this has to do with the decision points, the destinations, and the monitoring along the primary routes. And we want to use wayfinding as something that will enhance the community and not appear to be cluttered. So a lot of the signage that you have around town, we will probably recommend that a lot of that will be removed and replaced. Maybe not, probably not replaced in some of these exact locations, but strategically thinking about locations is very important. Utilizing the community branding along the way. So we have a kind of an overarching philosophy to wayfinding that we place into four key categories: function, approach, branding, and the future. And I've already talked a little bit about this. In terms of the functional part of it, it's really just determining on a systematic way where signage and components will be placed and making sure that it is logical. That's really important. And again, we try and place ourselves in a pair of running shoes or behind a steering wheel and begin to predict where and what and how. So our approach to this is really working over the next 2 to 3 months, I think is what we have projected. Working closely with you all. We'll be coming back on several more occasions with some actual ideas. We'll be wanting your input tonight and at additional meetings. It won't be necessarily all about me talking to you. Hopefully we get through this Wayfinding 101 and then we can move into some real applications. I talked about branding. We're definitely going to take advantage of what the community has gone through in the past several months and utilize that and become part of the system and part of this uniformity that we talked about. And then I talked to you about the kit of parts that we're always looking for future applications, trying to predict how signage and wayfinding can be used in the future and give you all the tools that you can use, after the initial phase or after we've completed this initial study. So getting into talking a little bit about the elements, and these are just a couple of examples of how communities have identified themselves with, and this has to do with gateways or really that big kind of wow iconic moment. And we certainly have some opportunities in Danville. Maybe this Danville City of First has changed to have the new brand on it. There are buildings that we can use. We're not necessarily saying replace this, so please don't get that impression. It's just an example of how buildings can be used to help create gateways or sub-gateways. I mean, these are some examples of cities, some very radical like Las Vegas, but how long has that Las Vegas sign be there? Has it been there? And people, identify with that. So that same kind of application can be used for a small community like Danville. And people, well, of course it says Las Vegas on it, but people recognize that. And that sign will probably still be around. It's kind of like the Hollywood sign. It'll probably be there forever. We've already got the one gateway sign, and certainly we would like to hear some input about that. Is that good, bad? Is it okay? Should we replace it utilizing this new design that we'll be coming up with, and not only here but in other locations? Directional signage is very important. Just a few examples of what's used in other communities, both street signs, pedestrian signs, and other directional signs that may be posted around the community. These kinds of signs are particularly important, and these examples are best. Their best application is in a downtown area. As you can tell, many of these have a pedestrian scale to them. Again, just a few examples of what you have. Whether, good, bad, or indifferent, this is what you have. Some of these are jurisdictional signs that I think we will have the opportunity to work with the Highway Department on some of this, but we definitely want to clean up and get some uniformity with the directional signage. And again, just a few examples of what other communities or other areas are doing just with their street signs. As this is 4 different kinds of street signs that you have in downtown or in Danville. Just think about it. If every street sign in Danville had something very similar to it, that begins, and you can say for a particular neighborhood, you can maybe modify that a bit, but just think about the uniformity and the character that you can create by using, similar kinds of designs and materials. Branding we talked about before. I won't go much into this, but we're definitely going to engage what has just been done and see how we can incorporate that into our wayfinding. I think this is really important. I won't spend a whole lot of time on it, but your branding study really took a step towards something that we do a lot of as part of wayfinding. But this study really helped us out as far as fonts and colors. And there's different standards of how dark backgrounds or light letters or vice versa. But we will probably use these colors to test on the designs and characters that we will be working on. So we have to deal with regulatory standards. There are some federal standards we refer to as the MUTCD, which is Manual on Uniform Traffic Control Devices, and which are very rigid federal standards, but the State Highway Department adopts these standards for all state highways. They're very restrictive, although within these standards there's a chapter called I think it's called Community Wayfinding. It loosens up the laces just a little bit, but it does loosen the standards up a bit. There are some subjective exceptions that can be made sometimes, but we will be meeting with the Highway Department to talk to them about Danville, and I think they've already expressed some concerns about what's going on with signs and wayfinding in the community. So we will be meeting with them to talk about what they may or may not allow with their standards. So we're going to be talking about destination points, and I want to jump into this, but what I really wanted to show you, this kind of goes into the talking about the standards, is all the primary routes in Danville are state highways. So for instance, in Corbin and Frankfort, we had a mixed bag of state and local streets. So we were able to do some things on local streets in Frankfort that the state would not allow us to do on some of the primary state routes. Most of the primary routes that we'll be talking about in Danville are state routes. So that belt's a little bit tighter, and we may not have as much flexibility as what we would like. The other thing that I wanted to point out here is you see the dashed line around. That is really the boundaries of what we're going to be looking at. It jumps outside. For the most part, it is the city limit, but it jumps outside in a few places. That doesn't mean that somewhere on Perryville Road or on Main Street that we may not have a sign that points straight to Perryville Battlefield. So don't, I don't know that we will, but don't feel like that because we have a limit of our work that we're not going to have, we're not going to be thinking about Perryville Battlefield or Fort Herod or something like that, because I think wayfinding needs, you want people that are going to Perryville Battlefield to come through Danville. So, but you want, when they leave, you want to make sure they feel like, oh, well, that was great. I was able to get in, spend time downtown or wherever, and be able to easily get out to go to Perryville. So you will see the little dashed circular lines, and I don't have a pointer, but this is our start of where we think the critical decision points should be located along these primary routes. What we haven't done is zoomed in specifically on the downtown area. There will probably be some more key decision points within the downtown area that we don't have on here tonight, but we will be looking at that as we move forward. just for kind of focusing in on the application, we have identified just 3 different destinations. 3, I think, pretty obvious destinations: Center College, Constitution Square, and the library. And while they're everybody knows that we probably want to have those as destinations on our list. But what is important to us is to, while I have my opinions about how I can fill this map up with destinations in the community, really want to hear from the community about what you all think is important. I know, 25, 30, 40 years ago what the important destinations are, and I feel like I know what they are now. But what is really critical is to hear from you all about what you think the most important destinations are in the community. So what I'm going to do, and I think I've got some extra writing utensils, is over the next few minutes or through the course of the meeting, I'd like for you all to list what you think the most important destinations are in the community. And that's really important to us to have that list that we can understand what's really critical to you all. And now, I will qualify this by saying that we may not have if we get, whatever, I'll just use 100 different destinations out of this meeting, that doesn't necessarily mean that we will have a sign for all 100 of these. We will use our experience and ability to assess to cull through these and determine what we think are the best destinations to have on signs or wayfinding components. Yes, ma'am.
Is this supposed to be tourist destinations? I mean, they're just...
Well, that's a good question. These would be any kind of destinations. For instance, the hospital. That's not necessarily a tourist destination, whereas Constitution Square would be. So, any important place that people need to get to. Yes, sir.
Should we include the Perryville battlefield?
If you think that is one of the most important places that,
How far outside the corporate limits?
well, I don't want to necessarily draw a line in the sand and say you can't go beyond that. But I think I'm going to express a little bit of an opinion here, which I'll end up doing anyway. I think Perryville Battlefield is probably a destination that people come to Danville would want to know about. But if it's a sign that points to Perryville and says downtown Perryville, I think they probably would know that. I can't even think of a business in downtown Perryville right now. But they would probably, and I don't want to necessarily point out specific. I think Perryville Battlefield is large enough of a regional, if not a statewide or even a national kind of attraction. I don't want to do, and I say this with all due respect, I don't want to do in Danville what should be done in Perryville. Does that make sense? Mm-hmm. And for instance, Fort Herod, maybe, but I'm not going to, I want to hear unbiased, I don't want to, yes ma'am.
To what extent should notice take into account the reality that certain things, Dollhouse Museum, one of the Pioneer Playhouse, are harder to find than the also extremely valuable community arts center, but that's right in the center of town. So how do you sort of factor that in when you're thinking of wayfinding?
Yeah, I don't want to get too technical about it. I maybe would ask that you be more intuitive about it. But if you feel like something is just really, and I'm trying to think of something in Danville, really tucked back in, way out of the way, but really is important. Yeah, I think absolutely maybe, you know.
Newspaper office,
Yes, ma'am.
I have another question. When you mentioned the hospital, are there not standard H signs that the state could?
For pointing to hospitals in every community, and would this plan also include our own signs for the hospital? Or
They
do those
could.
H signs
are the
Right.
ones that are known for people to look for the hospital? So
Right.
I'm just asking if the hospital,
does the library not have a little book as a standard? So
Mm-hmm.
are we talking about adding our own signs for those things?
Part of the Danville wayfinding system. If you think the hospital or the library, I'll use your examples, should carry more weight than the symbols, then it would not be disallowed by federal standards. And again, I'm wanting to, I'm kind of trying not to express my opinion, Jed, because I don't want to kind of bias. Yeah, I really want to know what your all's thoughts are. And maybe it is the newspaper office. Maybe it's something, if you think it's your house that you want people to come to, and you think that's the most critical thing, let me know. I probably won't, you probably won't end up with a sign. I'm being.
So do you want us to include on our list here, not include Center, Constitution Square, and the library, because you've already listed them as your top three?
I think that would be fair. And unless, if you think those are not 3 items that we shouldn't have, then maybe make a note there. And if you have 13 destinations, that's why there's some additional space at the bottom.
So those three are given and don't go in our list, is that the idea?
Well, I think they're given.
I mean, I would agree.
Yeah, that's why I tried to use some what I thought were some fairly obvious ones that there wouldn't be a whole lot of debate about. But so we don't have to. I mean, are there any other questions about that? Yes, sir.
Well, I have a question that is a little bit different, but it has to do more specifically with if you were trying to come up with a plan that sort of changes or condenses or consolidates signage. What is the relationship between what you're trying to do relative to Frankfurt and the State Department of Highways? For instance, I'm a Pioneer Playhouse.
Sure.
Green signs that are state signs manufactured by the state. We have brown signs that are state signs manufactured by the state. So I hate to ask the question and sound like it's a long answer, but what's the relationship between your endeavor and the state?
Well, and I mentioned, I'm not sure if you were here, but I mentioned that we will be interfacing with the state, and they may prefer that we have, and I'll use your example, Pioneer Playhouse, as part of our new wayfinding branded system, as opposed to the brown sign. You may not prefer it. I'd like to know that, but brown signs are actually, that's an international, clue and cue to people. So.
And then whatever plan that might be arrived at, you have to then sell that to the state or clear that with the state, and they would be possibly manufacturing new signs?
No, the state would not, whatever we come up with, the state will not manufacture. These will be, and I'll show some examples here in just a minute, these would not be your standard, aluminum, square, rectangular kinds of signs that they would. These would be a sign that would most likely be fabricated by a sign fabricator. I'm not sure, what the capacity or capabilities of the city might be, but for the most part, we're going to be looking at a sign that creates a character that probably would require a sign fabricator. Now, that doesn't necessarily mean that it would be expensive, but the State Highway Department would not pay for that. Indirectly, they may pay for it with a grant that you may obtain from the highway department. And I use the example of Frankfurt. Okay, well, keep thinking and give me your 10 or 12 or 20 ideas, whatever you can fit on the paper. We have other sheets too if you. So I talked about, I used the term family of signs, and this is a family that we created for the city of Frankfurt. So as you look at this, you can look at the various different scales of sign and different applications, whether it be gateway signs or pedestrian signs or vehicular signs, street signs, and if you look at this, you can see that there's an application just about for, or there's a design or suggestion here for just about every application you think of. I'm sure we've left out something, but there's directories that maybe you have, and this is where you get really down in the weeds, directories that may be in a downtown environment for pedestrians that have that map of downtown. And, you've seen them all, or you are here and you have everything located. Street signs, gateway signs, parking signs. So we will be creating a family of signs for Danville as part of this study. And then just a few examples of these that we're showing. Kind of zoomed in on the family, just giving you some specifics. Now, one thing that, I'll mention this because just to kind of prepare you, one of the real critical key standards with the state is what is on that sign. There's a fairly rigid, with just a little bit of flexibility, that any one sign on a state route cannot have more than 3 destinations or 3 directions. And you'll see on the Frankfurt sign, and I forget exactly on this sign, we have 4 on the one on the far left. That could have easily been a sign that we had on a local street, not a state route, if you'll recall I mentioned that. There is some exceptions that the state transportation cabinet may take to allow, say, 4 lines or 4 destinations. But, federal regulations are pretty strict. Yes, sir.
I noticed that you have some kind of color coding on these signs.
Right.
Just as I look at it, it seems like it would be more readable for having a series
Right.
of colors. Are these grouped according to some, does the color code
They
have
are,
anything
yeah.
to do with the destination itself?
They are, and it typically has to do with, like for instance, the hospital itself may not have a specific color, but if we have a sign that points to a downtown area, that may have a color. That let's just say on Lexington Avenue, maybe we have a sign that says downtown Danville, but then when you get at 4th or 3rd and Main, maybe there's a sign that's to the right is the courthouse and to the left is Constitution Square. But we will use colors, and we'll try and use the colors in that palette that I showed you before to help identify groupings of buildings or destinations. And downtown, we use these a lot in downtown areas when we're talking about colors. And again, just some more examples. Parking is believe it or not, is real critical, particularly for tourists and even sometimes residents. So when we get into, particularly in the downtown areas, we really look at parking. And we typically look at public parking, but we can use parking signs for private parking. The parking garage is owned by the city? It's paid, but that really doesn't play into it. But, that's an important destination, quite frankly, the parking garage. So just quickly, we're interested in really kind of the culture of Danville. We like to understand about things that go on in Danville to help us create character in wayfinding and signage and sometimes about our destinations. The history of Danville is important. As we began absorbing all of this, and I like to think I know a lot about the history and culture of Danville just because I've been involved in Danville many, many years. But these kind of things really do influence our decisions. What's here, what's important to the community, and it's all about creating a sense of place. So that's really kind of goes through my Wayfinding 101 and talking about destinations. The other thing that I want to kind of put dip our toes into the water tonight is really about the character of signs. And I know as you all travel around different communities around the state or community or the world or whatever, you may see different communities express or want to inform in different ways. If you go to Williamstown, that's going to be you're going to see history. So everything there is going to really talk about the history and the culture, and you're going to see some really classic examples of character. If you go to downtown Seattle, where it's perceived at least, and they hold themselves out as being a very kind of modern, progressive town, the signage, the character of the signage is going to express something probably different than Williamstown. So I think that's important that we talk about, and I began to get your all's feelings about character. So we're going to do a little hands-on test tonight, but I've got 3 different examples, and we're going to do a little voting here on the boards. But we have historic type of signs or possibilities, and Matt's going to turn these around. And again, these are fairly classic kinds of historic examples that you would see in historic places. Kind of that traditional, this is what I call my transitional character that's between the historic and the more contemporary or modern applications. And I have my opinions, but what I really want to find out is what your all's opinions are. So as you leave this evening, and we're going to open it up for some questions here first, but as you leave, what I'd like for you to do is to take one of these sticky pads and just place on here which one you like the best. And there's nothing really scientific about it, but it begins to give me an idea of what your all's thoughts are about what you like in terms of character. And that begins to inform us as we begin to create character for signage and wayfinding or placemaking elements. So that's really about the conclusion of what I wanted to present. Are there any other, let me back up before I end it up. I think I did mention that we'll be taking about 3 months here. So our next meeting, we'll be coming back in, let's say, we don't have a schedule yet, but in say 3 to 4 weeks in a similar kind of setting where we're going to actually bring some ideas in about what the family of signs may look like. And I don't want to get too absorbed in that, although that's important. And my experience says is that we probably won't spend much time on that because people will either like it or not like it. What we really spend time on is what the decision points and the destinations are. So that will really consume a lot of the conversation and discussion. So are there any other questions? Yes, ma'am.
I wasn't quite clear. You were saying that you would open it up to questions at some point.
This is now.
Whether we will be invited to speak, whoever would like to speak and say what's ever on our minds.
You've got the microphone, so.
So
what we've kind of structured these meetings in a way that it should be open, and I think an open dialogue and transparency is good. I've conducted studies like this in several different formats. Sometimes I will have a small group of people that supposedly represent their constituency. I felt like in Danville, just kind of knowing the place, that maybe just whoever wants to be involved in this meeting, that becomes our committee. I don't want to create a vacuum. So I don't mind people expressing opinions, or I think that's good. I think I want to know what's on your all's mind. If we can, hopefully, if everybody has something to say, maybe we can keep the comments condensed a bit, so we're not here.
Okay. It seemed to me that it might be important if people had something to say, since you're.
That's why I'm opening it up.
The next meeting is a third of the way through the process, so it sounds like, kind of a third. It seems like maybe it's
That's fair.
a good time if somebody has something to say. And
That'd be
and I
great.
have something to read, and it won't take me very long. My name is Lori Kagan Moore. You know that. I'm the founder and the owner of the Great American Dollhouse Museum, and I would very much like to thank the mayor and the commissioners and the city manager for budgeting money for this signage project, and I thank you for coming on board with us. There are a lot of aspects of this project that are without controversy. I think we are all delighted that we will have new, attractive, professional signage that complies with state code, and that's pretty exciting. The problem, and I feel sorry for you a little, because this comes with a history, and so you inherited. Maybe that happens in every city, that there's a history. I don't know, but the problem is that Danville's cultural attractions fear that we will not be properly represented in the signage initiative. While it is valuable to be signed on side streets close to our establishments, and that is important, it is also essential that we be signed on the bypass, and that's been the area where there's been some contention. We understand that bypass space is limited, but since there are very few attractions that qualify for signage under standard guidelines, we believe that if space is shared fairly, we can all be represented adequately. It has been proposed that the city's cultural attractions be clumped for signage into generic categories on the bypass, categories such as museums and theaters. Marketing professionals have stressed time and again that this kind of generic signage is entirely ineffective. One nationally recognized city marketer, Roger Brooks, uses as his tagline the phrase, "jettison the generic." When Cincinnati marketing and branding professional Kelly Kolar visited Danville, she spoke enthusiastically in favor of specific signage on outer belts to lure travelers into downtowns, areas that, by definition, are bypassed. I recently wrote a letter to John Gann, president of Gann Associates, who consults, trains, and writes on community marketing, and was formerly an associate of Cornell University. I asked him if he knew of any articles that would explain to those who don't understand why attractions need specific signage on bypasses. And he was kind enough to respond to my email, and the following is an excerpt from his letter. Ms. Kagan Moore, I don't have any articles that urge sign installation for specific local attractions. In my experience in working with cities, installation of such signs is done routinely and is not an issue. It's so obviously something you want to do, it's not worth writing about. I have commented in some of my articles that wayfinding signs directing motorists to the local, quote, historic downtown aren't enough, because while these signs tell you where downtown is, they give you no reason to go there. And every city and town calls its downtown historic. I don't believe a sign directing people to Danville's, quote, museums, unquote, will do much. No one visits, quote, museums. People do visit a specific museum. Specifics sell, generalities do not. And that's the excerpt from the letter. So I would like to encourage Danville to do what thousands of other cities in the nation have done, and to support our local cultural assets by signing them to travelers.
Well thought out comments, thank you.
Microphone?
Ma'am, could you share your written comments, or give him a copy of your comments?
I would be delighted.
He's trying
Right.
to write some notes, but I'm sure he won't get the essence of everything.
Thank you, sir. I was going to ask after the meeting, but I will gladly accept. Thank you very much.
I'm Mary Beth Touchstone, and I'm a citizen. And I'd like to second what Lori was saying. My husband and I travel by car quite a bit, and it is the specific sign that will draw me into a town. We travel quite a bit between here and Texas, so we cover a lot of miles. And there are any number of generic little towns, little historic downtowns, and I've never turned off the road for a historic downtown. But the Janis Joplin Museum, there you go. So just wanted to throw in my 2 cents.
Or the Oz Winery in Kansas, which is actually a sign. I don't know why I thought about that, but we did go to that.
But you remembered it.
My comment, I already put my little yellow sticker there on sort of a downtown signage that looked attractive to me. I think I agree with Lori that we all want a beautification of Danville, and we're all Danvillians. And I think most of us here have sort of skin in the game, so this is an issue that we get focused on because it's our lifeblood that we bring tourists and visitors to our places. Mine is Pioneer Playhouse. But it seems to me that this kind of beautification downtown is very different from the bypass. It seems like on the bypass you do need bigger signs because people are traveling faster or they're higher rate of speed, and the state signs and those kind of state signs seem to work for me as far as when you're going fast, and I'm all for site-specific signs on the bypass.
Yes, sir.
Do you have,
I'm being repetitive here, but would you have some comments to make about this generic versus specificity issue? I think the point that's being made about specificity is a very important one, and I'd be interested to know how that factors in as a standard or a criterion in the philosophy that you represent.
It is important, and that's not an uncommon topic of discussion throughout a study like this, and it really becomes a balancing act, not necessarily just for me, but for really the entire community, and you all are going to help me make some decisions, but what you have to be careful about is not naming every address on Main Street or 3rd Street or whatever it is. But how do you best inform people that you turn left on 3rd Street to get to Chin's Jeweler? Do you really want a sign that has that particular storefront name? And again, we will take into consideration several things. Number one, we will take into consideration a lot. I mean, we're listening about this and what your all's opinions are, and that's why I wanted to find out what the important destinations are. We also look at some historical trends. We're in the process of looking at where people travel and where they, either by car or by bike or by walking, and trying to look at what the trends are for counts. And a lot of that has to do with the average daily traffic counts. So we know where people are traveling based on that. But it becomes we don't want to leave anybody out unless they ask to be left out. Mike probably doesn't want people to know where his office is, but.
A little late for that, John.
Although, just using a radical example, his office is right down the hall here. But it really is a balancing act, and I would ask, before we even come up with the recommendations, that if you feel like we haven't included enough, or if we've included too much on our destinations, we're going to be taking what you all tell us and attempting to make some valid decisions and recommendations. But I don't think this group will be shy about telling me if they have a different opinion than what we've come up with, and I hope not. And yes, ma'am.
I was just wondering how you plan for modifications and adding or subtracting something in the future?
Right. Well, that comes into the real specifics of how a sign is designed. And, well, I was going to maybe find a couple. A lot of the signs will be designed with, let me zoom in on. You will see that each one of these signs have what technically what we call panels, and when we come up with the details, those panels can be easily replaced. And I would recommend that those be replaced by panels and not by trying to scrape off the letters. But those signs are detailed such that those panels you can slide them out or unscrew them very easily. That's actually a very valid question because particularly if we get into some specificity on destinations. I'm going to yes, I think.
Would you go back to that map where you showed
Oh,
the
sure.
area that you were working on?
Yes, ma'am.
Working on? I have a question.
Okay, good.
That,
Yeah.
yeah, where those circles are.
Yes, ma'am.
Okay, so the circles are where you will be putting certain signs. Is that what you said?
Probably so. Those are our first take on what we call decision points. Those are critical intersections where people would want to know where something might be. And now, I mean, again, this is just a first take on that. And just because I have a circle doesn't mean that doesn't suggest the type of sign that it would be. For instance, and I wish I had a laser, but down here on Stanford Road at the bypass where you either keep going on the bypass or you turn in to go on Stanford Road. That may just be a gateway sign that suggests that you need to turn into Stanford Road. But maybe there is, and I'm going to retract some of that. Maybe there is something there that says, I mean, the obvious one that comes up is Pioneer Playhouse, or maybe the Danville Admiral Stadium, or but that's a key decision point.
Well, that's kind of my question about those, because that is where you will have vehicle traffic.
Yes, ma'am.
So, I mean, wouldn't there be a limit of how many signs you could have along those?
Yes, ma'am. We do.
Those kind of signs.
We do.
I think it's great when you get into town to have some more personalized things, but it just seems to me if there's already a standard for green signs and brown signs, and we're used to that around the state, that those kind of things would stay. And when you get closer in, then you would want your specific things. But however, I do think that out there at those points, there do need to be some specific.
Right. And certainly we could take a position that, okay, let's just use the standard state highway signs, the rectangular or square, green or brown signs, and that's fine. They work. They obviously work. But it really goes back to some of the comments I was making about creating character. And if we can get a sign with character to them that is still compliant with state standards, take the money issue off the table. If we could do that, I think people would usually gravitate towards that. If we can begin creating character at your doorstep and let that carry through the entire community. Yes, sir. I'm sorry.
That's okay. I've never heard of wayfinding before as a business or anything, but I've traveled quite a bit and even grew up in Europe, but it seems astonishing to me. You said you're not going to leave anybody out. I've never heard of, seen any place where a place like Chin's would be on Wayfinding.
Well, and that's why I use that as a radical example. I mean, I use that as a radical example, and we would, we would not, but that's the point, is that we can't use this wayfinding system to identify every business in downtown.
It seems like, public places and cultural places are what you put up signs for, right? Not commercial spaces.
Typically, yeah, typically the wayfinding, the larger scale wayfinding does not get into specifics. Now, we get into, we get into some of the downtown signs, just for example, the two signs on the right. Those may be along Main Street sidewalk somewhere that would have a map of downtown, and Chin's or Mike's office or some of the restaurants may be identified on that map. But we're getting really down in the weeds then. It's a different level of wayfinding. That's why I talked about the scale. I'm going to take these in order. Yes, ma'am.
Could you talk a little bit about your data collection practices? How do you go about, I mean, I know you mentioned traffic counts. What are some, and I assume just our lists aren't what are informing your process. So how do you go about
Yeah,
that?
thank goodness for the internet, because traffic counts, trip counts are, the State Highway Department has a significant amount of data on trip counts, traffic counts, average daily ADTs. There are different ways, I think is the name of the GPS, has some data that you can access. So we'll be looking at some of those databases to get,
But as far as what's important, that's determined by your conversations in the community?
we definitely do not discount that. That is extremely important. We kind of back into importance level based on statistics. In other words, and I'm just going to use some random, maybe radical examples. If there's 100,000 traffic count at the corner of 4th and Main, and there's only 20,000 traffic count at the corner of 2nd and Main, that tells us that 4th and Main is a lot more important. There's something there that people, although 2nd, maybe that's Constitution Square possibly, but so maybe that wasn't a good example. But I was saying the other side of Main Street. But I think you get the point that I was trying to make. So we draw some conclusions from statistics, but that's the objective part. These meetings are the subjective part, and we certainly take note of both. I think, did you have another question?
Well, I wasn't real clear about the answer that you gave to Eric's question about whether you favored specificity on bypass. I understand, of course, that
Yeah.
you don't want a Chin's jewelry sign. I think when you read these lists, you will find that in our town, there are a very limited number of cultural destinations of what you might call tourist attractions. And, I've been sort of involved in this wayfinding thing for a while now, and I've looked around in a lot of places, driving, and I've also looked on the internet, and it is not my observation that the bigger signs are not specific. It is my observation that very often, or most of the time, they are specific, so that when you drive around in a place like a bypass or something, that you do see signs for specifics. And since there are rather few of us, I think when you get these lists, you will be impressed by the fact that they're very redundant and they're kind of short.
That may be good, yeah.
Going back to Eric's question, in that event, that there aren't an overwhelming number, do you favor specific, on a place like our bypass that you're quite familiar with, do you favor specific attractions to be mentioned there?
I don't know that I have a real strong opinion about that. I'm not intentionally dodging your question with an answer, but I like if what you're telling me, or you and everybody is telling me that you want specificity, and if some of the trends, like I was talking about these counts, kind of bear that out, then I think that it could very easily be appropriate to have that. And I probably shouldn't use Chen's Jewelry as an example because Kevil's a close friend of mine, but maybe that's why it came to mind. But you certainly don't want to put Chen's Jewelry out on the bypass. I'm not sure Kevil probably wouldn't mind it, but again, just using that as an example, we have to, it's a balancing act. But on the other hand, if 150 people came to me and said, I want Chen's Jewelry's name out on the bypass, then maybe we would recommend that. But.
Well, so one of the things is that this list with its few things that need to be signed, one of the things that we could take into account is that I think for a lot of people in this room, they mean on the bypass. They don't just mean signage somewhere in town. But
and if you think that needs to be part of your comment, please make that. We will have plenty of opportunity to express your opinion about some of the decisions that we're making, and maybe we have something that we've labeled out on the bypass that the majority thinks that it shouldn't be, or maybe we've left something off. So it's an iterative process. We're not trying to do this in a vacuum. Yes, sir.
One situation that has brought the specificity issue out on the table has to do with the several, or the many, you might say, corporations that have places of business just off the bypass.
Right.
And the things that occur to me about that are that who are the people that are trying to find those? I think it's a limited number
Right.
of people, and we're not trying to attract people to those places. We're trying to make sure people who are going to deliver or pick up at those places know how to do it. But some of the proposals that I've seen or heard about have wanted specific signs about, I guess, every corporation that's
Right.
out in the industrial park or elsewhere.
Right.
It seems to me that's a place where a specific place of business that only seeks to draw a very limited group. I've heard the statement, well, we don't want the truck drivers to get mixed up and end up in downtown Danville.
Right.
Well, how many of those are there, and why can't the businesses they're dealing with help them find where they need to go?
Let me provide some clarity to that real quick. That industrial foundation map that exists in the community has nothing to do with anything the city has done. It has nothing to do with the wayfinding initiative that we've discussed here. It has been tossed around as really a distraction to what the city's trying to do. And I'm being honest. We have not talked about corporate names. We've not talked about corporate logos. That is not what we were talking about. The map that's been that has been handed around was created by the Industrial Foundation Group as part of their own initiative, but that is not part of what the city's doing, and it's just not. And so,
I understand it doesn't
right,
have any status or whatever, and I'm not even saying that.
right,
But I'm just heard this discussion about
right, and that's an.
specific corporations that have signed.
Right.
And that's exactly why I'm saying that it's not part of our conversation.
And I've mentioned this to Earl, that we have the ability to work with some of these GPS like ways, and you can consult with them and let them know that you don't want trucks coming through the downtown, and let them have a better route, so that I mean, the truck drivers, they may, okay, I turn left to go to downtown, and they get downtown and say, I don't want to be down here. So, and I was mentioning this, is technology in these kind of instances can really help us out. We don't need to give a sign, turn left to XYZ factory off of the bypass. I mean, those truck drivers are going to have that pretty well either known or identified on their GPS. So we take that in consideration. Okay, a couple more questions. Yes, ma'am.
I wanted to follow up on the question that Jennifer asked in your answer about the traffic and where you see lots of traffic, say at 3rd and Main, and you might presume that there's something major there as opposed to thinking, wow, there are 2 state roads underneath there, and there's a coffee shop, as compared with Norton Center for the Arts, which is not on a main street, but is a significant asset
Right.
in the community, and one we would not want overlooked. So I throw that out there. The other thing I didn't hear was anything having to do with the frustration level of visitors to our community when they can't find something. So again, not to belabor the
Right, right.
but it's off the beaten path, as is the Norton
Sure.
Center. How many times and how
Right.
angry does a person have to get, trying to find some of these assets that
Mhm.
we have that aren't getting to play simply because, or if you were going to depend on traffic flow and quantities of cars passing a particular location.
Well, I think that you mentioned some very valid points, and I use my radical example about traffic counts. Well, we're not going to make a decision just based on, if I see 50,000 cars at one location and only 10 at another location, I'm going to validate that with actual observations. But I think you used a really good word, and possibly maybe moving forward, talk about this, is in addition to destinations, is assets. And I think that's really key, whereas the Norton Center is really a valuable regional asset, and it's also a destination. It's not easily found, and you don't easily find parking when you go to an event there. So again, I've said this a couple of times. I try and put myself behind the steering wheel for each one of these destinations that you're all going to talk about, and in providing ease of movement around the community really is one of the ultimate goals of this. Yes, ma'am.
Can you talk a little bit about if there is a plan for how to determine when it comes to things, specific things being listed on the bypass, are there going to be certain qualifications for this round of wayfinding and moving forward so that it's a level playing field for everybody that comes through? If there is specific signage there, how do you qualify to be on it, or do you ever get
Yeah.
removed and things like that?
If you don't, yeah. That's I think when we come back, we will have, we'll come back with some, our kind of first round of ideas and suggestions, and we'll have some criteria that will accompany those. And a lot of the criteria really goes to, meeting the objectives, but, we'll begin thinking about this whole discussion about specificity. That's obviously on the minds of several of you, and we'll be thinking about that, and we'll set up what we think is some valid criteria, and I'm sure that there'll be discussion about that. But that's a good point that I think we will definitely talk about that criteria in our next meeting. Okay, I'm going to say let's have 2 or 3 more here. I'll be around a little bit longer, but I don't want to make people feel like they have to be here. I think this lady has been.
I'm just curious about, when I count 8 circles that are critical destination decision points.
Uh-huh.
So those being where they are, we also have, depending on if it's all state, depending on state, some of those state signs. But I also see those as gateways.
They could be, could be.
And do you mix gateway signs with other directional signs?
Well, we don't want to confuse. I think we look at what are really truly gateways. I think one, using my example of the intersection of Stanford Road going into town and in the bypass, I think one could say, yeah, that is truly a gateway point, because you're coming into Danville, whether you're going on the bypass or on Stanford Road. But you know, the circle I have there at where Wilderness comes into Main Street, you know, I wouldn't, that would not be a gateway. And again, I'm using, so, but going back to my example of Stanford Road and the bypass, you know, that perhaps is a combination of a gateway kind of sign, but yet, okay, this way to Perryville Battlefield and this way to Danville Admiral Stadium, and I don't know that those are the.
We have a Danville sign at all those 7 outer circles already.
But not like.
No, but,
Maple Avenue.
yeah, we have
The big foundation.
we have the foundation signs at each one of those 7 locations.
Down there, go drive.
Right. Now, we have one at every, 7 of them, right. There's, at those 7 locations, we have a sign.
So will all those get changed to be uniform?
Well,
No, to the new branding and everything else. And if you can fund, it's like $1 million, yeah.
I mean, in that,
A lot of money.
do you remember how much the one at Waterworks Road cost, Janet? You and I had talked about, I want to say it was like 15,000, just that one.
And I would hope
Right.
that fieldstone was, that was a very well thought out
Yeah.
down there. We like the fieldstone fences that we have in the county, we got more than a lot of counties have. And I would hope that if we added something to that or changed it, we would change the signage part.
That's what I think.
That's what I think.
Yeah.
The foundations are there, but
so we may be making recommendations for the, you know, changing all those out, but that doesn't mean it has to be done all at one time. So this is a master plan. Okay, I'm going to take a couple more questions and then I'll stick around, but if everybody wants to stay around, then that's fine too. But I don't want to, yeah. So I think, yes, sir.
Nick Wade with the Heart of the Eagle Main Street Program. I have 2 very brief comments. One, I would like to thank Earl for clarifying about the Industrial Foundation. I think that for a lot of people in the room, that's an area of contention, and so I appreciate that. And 2, we had a conversation about assets. And I don't want to discredit the Norton Center because it's a great regional asset that we have. We also have the Dollhouse Museum, which is one of only a handful in the country. So I think that as we talk about this conversation of specificity and cultural attractions, we really should think about what do we have that makes us unique in our community and what is an attractor to downtown.
And I'm going to say you're the last, but and then we'll stick around if we need to.
do you have any research, recommended reading, that would help us learn what are the key components of successful, well thought out wayfinding strategies and campaigns or efforts, whatever? George, we're gonna have a list here.
Well, we gave a couple of books in the part of the presentation, but those are somewhat academic kind of books, and unless you're just really into reading. Good. I actually do have a couple of, and I can't think of the name, but I have them stored on my network, maybe some good summaries. Yeah. So my wayfinding 101 wasn't enough? Darn. We want more, okay. Okay, great dialogue, and certainly I'm around, and hopefully, I think hopefully you took my card if you want to contact me, but in today's world, yeah.
You're coming back in 3-4 weeks?
Yeah, Earl and I will be scheduling that here in the next week or so.
Yeah, and we will put this PDF up on the city's website, and also we will try to do any suggested readings. If y'all want to go do some research, we'll try to post those articles up there.
Just put them up on the table.
Yes, absolutely. Yeah,
Don't
this will
forget-
be up there in the morning.
Don't forget
we'll
to
put this
vote.
up there tomorrow.
Give me your sheets.